This is the record of production for my Hand Crafted Jarrah Desk. Throughout this video, I will discuss the process I undertook to build my desk. But before we begin, work health and safety. While constructing my desk, I always wore enclosed upper leather shoes, had all loose items such as watches, ties, long sleeves, rolled back, tied up or removed. I ensured that before using any machinery, I had completed the appropriate safety training, and while using machinery, I followed the relevant standard operating procedures. I had the timber delivered mid-term 4. Following its drop-off, we carried it up to the timber rooms. Then I began to mark it up and cut it down to size so that it would fit into the storeroom better. I used a pencil, steel rule, tri-square, drop saw and table saw to do this work. I used the drop saw to cut some of the pieces to a shorter length, while my teacher Mr. Stewart ran the wood through the table saw to rip it to width for me. Before doing all this, I ensured that I had completed the relevant safety training and followed all standard operating procedures. While marking up the timber, I was careful not to scratch myself on any of the sharp metal edges of the marking implements. Cutting the wood down to size went well. However, if I were to do it again, I would use a better indexing system to help me identify the use of certain pieces faster after they had been cut to length, but not to width. Following this, I began to measure and mark my timber for the side panels for my project. First the long stiles, then the rails. Once again, I used a steel rule, tri-square and pencil. To ensure that all my measurements were accurate, I first marked a face side and then face edge on my timber. I then based all my measurements off these faces so that they were consistent. I then cut these pieces to length on the drop saw, ensuring that all relevant standard operating procedures were followed and being careful to prevent offcuts from falling on my feet. I then marked the mortise and tenon joints on all my long stiles. I used a mortise gauge, rule and pencil and worked off the face sides and edges of the wood to ensure consistent and accurate marking. I had to be careful not to prick myself on the sharp points of the mortising gauge. Following that, I cut the mortises out using the mortising drill. I was careful to keep my hands clear of the drill bit and to ensure that I wore eye protection. Cutting the mortises went well, however it was difficult to make fine adjustments to the positioning of the drill bit in regards to its centering over the workpiece. After cutting the mortises with the mortising drill, I used a mortise chisel to clean out the joints and to square up the bottom corners of the mortise, while being careful to keep my hands behind the blade of the chisel. Next, I cut the tenons on my rails. Once again, I marked them up using a steel rule, tri-square, pencil and mortising gauge. I cut the first set of tenons on the router table, however it broke later on. So I designed and made a jig that used a plunge router to cut the rest of the tenons. Unfortunately, the jig left about 3mm of material on the end of the tenon, which I chiselled off after cutting all of the tenons. Cutting the shoulders on the tenons for the centre rail was done using the bandsaw. It was difficult to mark these up as it was hard to place the tri-square flat on the tenon. After this, I fitted each mortise and tenon joint and then dry fitted all of my frames. Here is a photo of one of my frames in a dry fit. All the rails are square with the sides and the panel is square as well. A few of my mortises are sitting a little high or a little low. This is due to fluctuations in the wood and slight inaccuracies in the cutting of the mortise and tenon. After marking the half-lap joint on my wood, following my face side and edge marks, I cut the tenon of my half-lap joint using the same jig as I used for my mortise and tenon joints, with the stile clamped firmly in place and the router set to a lower depth. To cut the long rebates for the panels of my frames, I set up a sort of jig on the workbench. Clamping one piece of wood to the desk, I added more wood as needed to ensure that the workpiece hung just slightly over the edge. After carefully marking the length of the router from the end of my joints, I clamped on this line, stopping the router from cutting too much out of my joints. I used a plunge router because I had to make 2 passes with the router, starting at a higher depth and working down. I was careful not to put the router back onto the desk while the bit was still spinning. Cutting the housing for the half-lap joints was a little trickier. I decided to use the trimmer with a jig to speed up the process. However, I first had to break the end grain at either end of the housing to stop it chipping out. The jig hooked onto the end of the workpiece and was then clamped in place. After routing out the housing, I then used a chisel and mallet to clean up and fit the joint. While using the trimmer, I wore hearing and eye protection, and when not in use, I unplugged it from the power point. After dry fitting all the joints on my side panels and my back panels, I made the internal support frames for my desk. I marked and cut these using a tri-square, ruler and drop saw. I then marked the rebates with a marking gauge. Because I had to cut so many joints, I decided to use the bandsaw. To make consistently sized and straight cuts, I built a fence for the bandsaw and clamped it in place. My first frame required a little bit of fitting, but all 4 of them came out flush and square. Gluing up my side frames was a tricky process. With so much movement and so many pieces, I had to work carefully. I started by sealing the end grain where it was exposed to the joint by rubbing a little bit of glue over it. Then I applied glue to the joints and clamped it all together, being careful to keep the frame flat on the clamps so as to avoid twisting or bowing it. I needed to widen the boards to 290mm for the filing drawers on my desk. I did this with a biscuit joint. I marked the joints, being careful not to put them near the end of a drawer. Then I used the biscuit joiner to cut the holes for the biscuits along the side. I wore eye and ear protection, as well as ensuring the joiner was connected to dust extraction. Here is an animation of the deconstruction of my side panel and pedestal.